Montgomery, Alabama, April 1969. Elvis Presley was performing Suspicious Minds when a voice from the darkness hurled a racial slur at his four black backup singers, the Sweet Inspirations. The music died. 35,000 people fell silent. Elvis walked to the front of the stage and made a choice that would cost him his Southern career, but define his legacy forever: the divided America. To understand what happened that night in Montgomery, you have to understand the America of April 1969. Just 1 year earlier, Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in Memphis. Cities had burned in the aftermath. The National Guard had been deployed to multiple states, and the backlash against integration was still fierce, particularly in the Deep South. Montgomery, Alabama wasn't just any southern city. It was the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement, where Rosa Parks had refused to give up her bus seat in 1955, where Dr. King had led the bus boycott that launched him to national prominence. By 1969, the city was a complicated symbol, proud of its place in American history, but also home to residents who deeply resented the changes forced upon them. When Elvis Presley's tour announced a Montgomery stop with prominent black performers featured in his show, it became a flashpoint for tensions that had been simmering for years. Elvis himself had always occupied a strange position in the racial politics of American music. He had built his career on what was essentially black music, rhythm and blues, gospel, the sounds he'd absorbed growing up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi, listening to black radio stations and attending black churches. But now, in 1969, he was making a statement by featuring the Sweet Inspirations prominently in his show, giving them solo moments, treating them as stars rather than as anonymous background voices. And some people were furious about it. The Sweet Inspirations. The Sweet Inspirations weren't just any backup singers. Cissy Houston, the group's founder and leader, was already a legend in gospel and soul music circles. Her daughter, Whitney, would later become one of the greatest voices in music history. But in 1969, Cissy was the star. Alongside her were Myrna Smith, Sylvia Shemwell, and Estelle Brown, four incredibly talented women who had sung with everyone from Aretha Franklin to Wilson Pickett. They were professionals, veterans of the music industry who had paid their dues in clubs and recording studios where black artists were often treated as second-class citizens. When Elvis hired the Sweet Inspirations for his 1969 return to live performing, it was a significant statement. He wasn't just giving them jobs, he was giving them visibility, featuring them prominently on stage in elaborate matching gowns, giving them microphones for harmonies that the entire arena could hear, treating them with a respect that was far from universal in the entertainment industry of that era. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, had actually advised against featuring them so prominently, warning that it could hurt ticket sales in certain markets. Elvis had ignored that advice. The women themselves had mixed feelings about touring through the South. They had grown up there, knew its beauty and its ugliness, and understood that their presence on stage with Elvis would be seen as provocative by some audience members. Before the tour started, they had discussions about how to handle potential incidents, whether to ignore hecklers, whether to respond, what to do if things got truly dangerous. But nothing could have prepared them for what happened in Montgomery. The tension builds. The evening had started with an undercurrent of tension that the performers could feel even before the show began. As fans filed into the Montgomery Coliseum, there were pockets of visible discomfort. Older white patrons who had perhaps bought tickets without realizing that black women would be featured so prominently. Younger attendees who seemed excited by the integrated performance, and an overall atmosphere that felt charged with something beyond typical concert energy. Security had been increased for the Montgomery stop, not because of any specific threat, but because everyone involved in the production understood that this was a potentially volatile situation. Backstage, Elvis had been unusually quiet during the pre-show routine. Band members later recalled that he seemed more serious than usual, less prone to his typical joking around and nervous energy. The Sweet Inspirations went through their usual vocal warm-ups and costume checks, trying to treat this show like any other, even though they knew it wasn't. The first half of the concert went smoothly, perhaps deceptively so. Elvis opened with high-energy numbers that got the crowd on their feet. The band was tight and professional, and the Sweet Inspirations provided the powerful vocal support that had made them such a valuable addition to Elvis's sound. By the time they reached Suspicious Minds, one of his biggest recent hits, everything seemed to be going perfectly. Suspicious Minds was always a highlight of Elvis's shows during this period. The Sweet Inspirations had a crucial role in the arrangement, their voices weaving around Elvis's lead, creating a sonic texture that made the song feel urgent and alive. They were about halfway through, building toward the song's dramatic bridge, when everything changed in an instant. A voice from somewhere in the middle section of the Coliseum cut through the music with a racial slur slur directed at the women on stage. The moment everything stopped, the words were clear enough that everyone in the venue heard them. In the immediate aftermath of the slur, time seemed to slow down in that arena. Elvis had been mid-phrase when he heard it, and his voice simply stopped. The microphone dropped to his side. The sweet inspirations had frozen in their positions, their faces showing a mixture of shock, hurt, and something that looked like resigned familiarity. This wasn't the first time they'd faced racism, but it was perhaps the most public. The band members were looking at each other and at Elvis, uncertain whether to keep playing or stop. And 35,000 people were suddenly silent. Elvis didn't consult with his band, didn't look to his manager in the wings, didn't pause to calculate the professional consequences of what he was about to do. He walked to the front of the stage, his face showing an anger that people who knew him recognized as rare and serious. The spotlight operators, uncertain what was happening, kept the lights trained on him as he raised the microphone to his lips and spoke in a voice that was controlled but shaking with fury. "Stop right there!" Though he wasn't shouting, the words carried to every corner of the arena. "We're not going to continue until something is made clear here." The speech that changed everything. The silence was absolute now. 35,000 people holding their breath. I heard what was just said. A lot of you heard it too. And I want everyone in this arena to understand something right now. He turned and gestured toward the sweet inspirations, who were standing motionless at their microphones, tears visible on Myrna Smith's face. "These ladies are not just my backup singers. They are not just here to make me sound good, though Lord knows they do that. These women are artists. They are my colleagues. They are my friends." Elvis paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was even more intense. "And more than that, they are my family." The way Elvis emphasized the word family carried weight beyond its literal meaning. In the South of 1969, claiming black people as family was a radical statement, a rejection of the entire social order that segregation had been designed to maintain. I come from Mississippi. I grew up poor, and you know who helped my family when we had nothing? Black families. They shared their food with us. They taught me how to sing. They gave me the music that made all of this possible. He gestured around the arena, at the stage, at the lights, at everything his career had become. These ladies are not just part of my show. They are the show. And more importantly, they are human beings who deserve respect. Elvis paused, letting the moment breathe, and when he spoke again, his next words would be quoted in newspapers across the country the next day. "Now, I can see the exit doors from here. They're not hard to find. If you can't give these women the respect they deserve, if you can't listen to them sing without hate in your heart, then I invite you to leave right now." His voice rose slightly, filled with conviction, "because we're not going to continue until everyone here understands that this stage, this show, this music, it belongs to all of us, not just to people who look like me." The response. The silence that followed Elvis's words was deafening. For what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody knew what was going to happen next. This was the moment of maximum danger. Elvis had drawn a line, had made it clear that he was willing to sacrifice the show and potentially his career in the South over this principle. Then someone started clapping. Then more people joined. Within seconds, the majority of the 35,000-person audience was on their feet applauding, some cheering, some crying. The sweet inspirations, who had been frozen in shock during Elvis's speech, were now embracing each other, tears streaming down their faces. But this wasn't a unanimous response. There were sections of the arena where people remained seated, where arms stayed crossed, where faces showed anger at what they had just heard. And there was movement toward the exits as some attendees, perhaps a few hundred people, decided to leave rather than accept what Elvis had demanded of them. Security later reported that the exit of those few hundred was tense, some shouting insults as they left, others arguing with family members who wanted to stay. There was at least one physical altercation in the concourse as someone tried to prevent their companion from leaving. But the vast majority of the audience remained. And then something remarkable happened. "We shall overcome" someone in the crowd, and nobody ever identified who started it, began singing the opening lines of "We Shall Overcome," the anthem of the civil rights movement. Elvis stood on that stage, visibly moved, tears running down his face as he listened to the crowd sing. The sweet inspirations joined in, their professional voices lifting above the crowd's earnest but imperfect harmonies. And then Elvis himself began to sing, his voice blending with theirs and with the thousands in the arena, creating a moment that nobody present would ever forget. It wasn't a planned part of the show. It wasn't something they'd rehearsed. It was simply what happened when people chose unity over division, when they chose to stand together rather than allow hate to win. When the spontaneous singing finally ended, Elvis wiped his eyes, took a deep breath, and made made a decision that would change the rest of the show. Instead of returning to Suspicious Minds where they'd left off, he turned to the Sweet Inspirations and asked them what they wanted to sing. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't how Elvis's shows were structured, but this wasn't a normal show anymore. What happened next was unprecedented in Elvis's performing career. Their moment. Cissy Houston stepped forward to her microphone, conferred briefly with the other three women, and then said something to Elvis that the audience couldn't hear. Elvis nodded, walked to the band leader, and gave instructions. Then he did something unprecedented. He stepped back from center stage and gave the Sweet Inspirations the spotlight for a full song. Not as background to his lead, but as the featured performers. They sang People Get Ready, the Curtis Mayfield gospel soul classic about liberation and hope. And they sang it with everything they had, pouring out emotions that had been building for years of performing in the shadow of racism, years of being treated as less than they were. Elvis stood behind them during that performance, not singing, just standing there as a visible sign of support, occasionally adding a harmony line, but mostly letting them have the moment. The crowd listened in a hushed, reverent silence that was completely different from the energetic applause of a typical concert. This felt more like church than entertainment, more like witnessing something sacred than watching a show. When the Sweet Inspirations finished, the standing ovation lasted for several minutes. Myrna Smith later said it was the most powerful moment of her entire career, but the consequences of that night were just beginning. The immediate aftermath. News of what had happened spread quickly, first through word of mouth as attendees called friends and family, then through local newspaper coverage, and eventually through national media outlets. The headline in the next day's Montgomery Advertiser read, "Elvis takes stand on race at concert." Within days, the story had been picked up by newspapers across the country, with reactions falling along predictable lines based on the political leanings of the publications and their readers. For Elvis personally, there were immediate professional consequences. Several southern venues that had been tentatively scheduled for future tours quietly informed his management that they were no longer interested in hosting him. Radio stations in certain markets reduced their Elvis rotations or stopped playing his music altogether. Colonel Parker was reportedly furious, not because he disagreed with what Elvis had done morally, but because he saw the financial implications. Letters poured into Elvis's fan club offices, about 60% expressing support for his stance and 40% expressing anger, disappointment, or outright hatred. Some of the negative letters were so vicious, so filled with racial slurs and threats, that they had to be turned over to law enforcement. But there were positive consequences too, perhaps more significant in the long run. The Sweet Inspirations, who had been well known in certain circles but not mainstream stars, suddenly found their profile elevated significantly. They were invited for interviews on television shows, profiled in magazines, and offered recording opportunities that might not have come their way otherwise. Within the music industry, Elvis's stand had ripple effects. Other white artists who featured black performers began to speak more openly about racial issues, perhaps emboldened by Elvis's example. The incident became a case study in how to handle racism when it erupts in public spaces, not by ignoring it or trying to smooth it over, but by confronting it directly and making clear what values you stand for. Entertainment venues began implementing clearer policies about acceptable behavior, and some artists began including explicit anti-discrimination clauses in their performance contracts. For Elvis himself, the Montgomery concert seemed to crystallize something that had been forming in his mind for years. He had always been uncomfortable with the way he was credited as the creator of rock and roll when he knew he was building on foundations laid by black artists. Montgomery changed that. In interviews following the concert, Elvis began speaking more openly about his debt to black music and black culture. He used his platform to recommend black artists to journalists, to talk about the systemic inequities in the music industry, to push back against the narrative that he had invented rock and roll. His relationship with the Sweet Inspirations deepened after Montgomery. They weren't just his employees anymore. They became genuine friends, people he trusted and confided in. When Cissy Houston's daughter Whitney began showing vocal talent as a child, Elvis encouraged Cissy to nurture that gift, told her that Whitney could be even greater than her mother. But there was also a weight that came with the Montgomery stand. Elvis received death threats following the concert, serious enough that his security detail had to be increased significantly. There were concerns about assassination attempts, particularly when he performed in certain southern cities. He tried not to show fear publicly, but people close to him noticed that he became more paranoid, more isolated, more dependent on the protective bubble that his fame had already created around him. Some biographers have suggested that the increased security and isolation following Montgomery contributed to Elvis's later struggles with prescription drugs and his retreat from public life. To fully appreciate what Elvis did that night in Montgomery, it's important to understand what he risked and what was at stake. In 1969, taking a public stand against racism wasn't just morally right. It was professionally dangerous for a Southern white entertainer whose fan base was largely conservative and Southern. Elvis wasn't naive about this. He knew that his position as the king of rock and roll was dependent on maintaining good relationships with the very people he was challenging. He knew that Colonel Parker's ability to book shows in certain markets would be compromised. He knew that some fans would never forgive him, but he did it anyway, and that matters. The legacy lives. On 50-plus years after the Montgomery concert, the story continues to resonate. The sweet inspirations, or at least those members still living, still talk about that night in interviews and memoirs. They describe it as a defining moment not just in their careers, but in their lives. A time when they felt truly seen and valued in a way that had been rare in their experience. They credit Elvis with using his power and privilege to protect them, to elevate them, to insist that they be treated with dignity even when it cost him professionally. For younger generations learning about this story, it often comes as a surprise. The popular narrative of Elvis Presley tends to focus on his music, his style, his movies, his tragic end, but not necessarily on his moral courage or his stance on civil rights. Yet this moment is part of his legacy, as important in its own way as any of his hit records or iconic performances. It's a reminder that artists have platforms that extend beyond entertainment, that they have the power to influence culture in ways that transcend their art, and that how they use that power matters. The Montgomery concert also serves as an interesting case study in how moral stands over time. In 1969, what Elvis did was controversial, dividing his audience and costing him professionally. Today, everyone agrees that he did the right thing, and the people who left that concert in protest look like the villains of history. This pattern repeats throughout history. Actions that are risky and divisive in the moment become obviously correct in retrospect, once the moral arc has bent far enough. The question for each generation is whether we have the courage to do what will look obviously right 50 years from now, even when it's controversial and costly in the present. On April 12, 1969, in Montgomery, Alabama, Elvis Presley had to choose between his comfort and his conscience, between professional safety and moral courage, between silence and speech. He chose conscience, courage, and speech. He didn't save the world that night. He didn't end racism. He didn't even necessarily change many minds in that arena, beyond the ones already inclined to agree with him. But he did something important nonetheless. He drew a line. He said clearly and publicly that some things matter more than applause or ticket sales or fan approval. He stood with 4 black women who were being disrespected and said, in effect, if you disrespect them, you disrespect me. And if that costs me fans, so be it. In the grand sweep of American history, this might seem like a small moment, but history is made of small moments, of individual choices by individual people at crucial junctures, and sometimes the choice of one person with a platform and a voice can echo forward through time, can become part of a larger story about who we are and who we want to be. The Montgomery concert is one of those moments, a time when Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, showed that he was willing to risk his crown for something more important than himself. The 4 women standing behind him that night never forgot it. The fans who stayed and cheered never forgot it. And the people who left in anger probably never forgot it either, though for different reasons. 50 years later, we're still talking about what happened in that arena, still trying to understand what it meant and what it means. That's the power of moral courage. It reverberates beyond the immediate moment, creating ripples that spread farther than anyone could predict. The women who never forgot. In 2010, Myrna Smith gave what would be one of her final interviews before her death in 2013. When asked about the Montgomery concert, she broke down crying. 41 years later, the emotion was still raw. I've performed for presidents. I've sung on stages all over the world. I've had a career that most people only dream of, Myrna said. But that night in Montgomery, when Elvis stopped everything and stood up for us, that's the night I felt like I mattered. Not as a voice, not as a performer, as a human being. Estelle Brown, in a 2008 documentary, revealed something that the other Sweet Inspirations had never publicly shared. They had discussed quitting the tour after Montgomery. "We were scared," Estelle admitted. "The death threats weren't just against Elvis. They were against us, too. People saying they'd hurt us for corrupting Elvis, for getting above our place. We seriously considered leaving the tour for our own safety. But Elvis wouldn't let us go. Not because he needed us professionally, though he did, but because he said if we left, if we let the racists win, then everything that happened in Montgomery would be for nothing. He said, we stand together or we don't stand at all." Sylvia Shemwell, who passed away in 2010, wrote in her unpublished memoir about a conversation she had with Elvis the day after Montgomery. "He came to our hotel room, which shocked us, because white men didn't visit black women's hotel rooms in 1969 Alabama without causing a scene. He sat down and said, 'I need to apologize to you ladies.' We were confused. Apologize for what? He defended us. But Elvis said, 'I'm sorry that you had to experience that. I'm sorry that my world, the world of white America, treated you that way. And I'm sorry if my standing up for you put you in more danger. But I want you to know something. I meant every word I said last night. You are my family, and I will defend my family with everything I have." Sylvia wrote, "That's when I understood Elvis wasn't just being a good employer or making a political statement. He genuinely saw us as equals, as sisters, as people he loved. In 1969, that was revolutionary. But there's one more detail that shows the lasting impact of that night. The ripple effect continues. In 1994, 25 years after the Montgomery concert, a young black woman named Angela Martinez was studying music at Alabama State University. She was struggling with whether to continue pursuing a career in an industry that still had significant racial barriers. Her grandmother, who had been in the audience at Montgomery in 1969, took her to the site where the old Coliseum had stood. It had been demolished in 1985. She told Angela the story of what Elvis had done that night. "My grandmother said, that white man risked everything, his career, his safety, his money, to stand up for 4 black women he didn't have to protect. If he could do that in 1969, when it cost him everything, you can pursue your dream in 1994, when the doors are at least partially open." Angela Martinez went on to become a successful music producer, working with artists like Alicia Keys and John Legend. She credits her grandmother's story about Montgomery as the moment she decided not to give up. "I keep a photo of the Sweet Inspirations on my desk," Angela said in a 2019 interview. "Not because they were great singers, though they were, but because they survived that moment. They kept going. And Elvis's willingness to risk everything for them showed me that allies exist, that people will stand with you, that you don't have to fight alone." Stories like Angela's are why Montgomery matters beyond that one night. The concert became a teaching moment, a reference point, a reminder that moral courage is possible even when it's costly. In 2019, on the 50th anniversary of the Montgomery concert, the city of Montgomery erected a historical marker at the site where the Coliseum once stood. The marker reads, "On this site, April 12, 1969, Elvis Presley stopped his concert after a member of the audience directed a racial slur at his backup singers, the Sweet Inspirations. Elvis publicly demanded that the audience treat the performers with respect, stating, 'They are my family.' His stand cost him professionally, but demonstrated that moral courage requires sacrifice. This moment represents both how far we had come and how far we still had to go in 1969, and reminds us that progress requires individuals willing to risk comfort for conscience." The dedication ceremony was attended by Cissy Houston, then 85 years old, and members of the Presley family. Cissy spoke to the crowd. "Elvis didn't end racism that night. One man can't end a system that's centuries old, but he showed us what allyship looks like. He used his privilege and his platform to amplify our voices, to demand our dignity, to stand with us when standing with us cost him something real. That's what we need more of, not white saviors, but white allies willing to risk something, to sacrifice something, to stand up when it's uncomfortable." And that's the final lesson of Montgomery. What we can learn today. The Montgomery concert teaches us that moral courage isn't about grand gestures or dramatic speeches, though Elvis's speech was both. It's about the willingness to risk something you value for someone else's dignity. Elvis risked his Southern fan base. He risked his touring income. He risked his safety. He risked his comfort. And he did it in seconds, without calculating the cost, because in that moment, he saw 4 women being dehumanized and he couldn't stay silent. How many of us in our daily lives see injustice and stay silent because speaking up would be uncomfortable? Because it might cost us a friendship, a job opportunity, a comfortable position in our community? Montgomery reminds us that silence is a choice, that neutrality in moments of injustice is itself a form of injustice, that if we're not willing to risk something for others' dignity, then our values don't mean much. The Sweet Inspirations needed Elvis to stand with them that night, but Elvis needed that moment too, to prove to himself that his success hadn't made him forget where he came from, that his privilege hadn't made him indifferent to others' suffering, that he was still the man his mother had raised him to be. Both sides of that equation matter. The oppressed need allies, and the privileged need to be reminded that their comfort is built on systems that hurt others. Elvis Presley made a lot of music in his lifetime, but that night in Montgomery, he made history. Subscribe to Elvis Presley Legacy Stories to discover more moments that prove courage. Sometimes means risking everything you've built for what you know is right. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that silence in the face of injustice is its own form of betrayal, and that speaking up matters, even when it costs you. And the next time you witness injustice and wonder whether your voice matters, remember Montgomery. Remember that one person's stand can change everything, because that's what legends do. They use their platform not just to entertain, but to elevate, not just to perform, but to protect, not just to succeed, but to stand for something. Elvis stood that night, and the world is better for it.